Welcome to Module 5 in the Inclusive Education Paraprofessional Training Series. This segment is titled Learning Environments and Behavior Support. The objectives for this module are to identify how positive learning environments and positive behavior support strategies form a multi-tiered system of support for students, and to identify strategies and possible next steps for a student that you work with that may be demonstrating challenging behavior. Our agenda for this module involves first defining behavior in schools, understanding systems and approaches to challenging behavior, including MTSS, multi-tiered systems of supports, PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports, and SEL, social emotional learning. We'll then identify strategies that value students and promote student engagement in the classroom. Behavior support is an area where we know that educational professionals are often requesting additional information. In this module, our goal is to establish a foundation for how we define and respond to behavior in schools, as well as to give you an opportunity to identify a few immediately actionable next steps that you can take to support a student in your setting and in your role as a paraprofessional. Within this module, we also provide supplemental resources that we encourage you to refer back to as needed, and offer some deeper dive activities should you want to continue extending your thinking around the impact of learning environments and the impact of approaches to responding to behavior in schools. Let's begin by brainstorming. Take notes for yourself in whatever form works best for you. For example, on paper, on the computer, as a doodle, or as an audio note. Jot down the word behavior. Now take a minute to jot down any words, terms, or ideas that come to mind when you think about behavior. You can pause this recording if you need more time. Take a moment to review what you have. Do you see any emerging themes or connections? Hold on to these thoughts. We'll come back to them. Let's try once more, but this time, instead of reacting to the term behavior, you should react to the term behavior support. Take a minute to jot down behavior support, and then fill in any words, terms, or ideas that come to mind when you think about behavior support. Again, pause this recording to give yourself the time you need, and then look back at what you have. Let's talk about it. Look at your two brainstorms side by side. What do you notice? What stands out to you? Was the way you were thinking about behavior compared to behavior support more similar or different? Was one more positive than the other? What kinds of actions and responses are coming out in each of your brainstorms? Understanding these kinds of patterns in our thinking is an important starting point to helping us think about behavior and the needs of our students in a more holistic and empathetic way. On this slide is a quote. It reads, "I have come to a frightening conclusion. I am the decisive element that creates the climate. It is my daily mood that makes the weather. As a teacher, I possess tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or humor, hurt or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized." Reflect on that for a moment. What resonates with you? As a teacher and as a member of various educational teams, I was always reminded of the responsibility that every one of us has individually and together in influencing students' experiences. Now let's talk about how we define behavior. What is behavior? How is that decided? And by whom? The answers to these questions reflect a deep-seated history around difference being understood as deviance and behavior as bad. In this first bullet point, we have that behavior is a socially constructed concept, meaning that what constitutes behavior is determined or decided by society and then named or labeled accordingly. So just as disability and disability labels are socially constructed, so is the meaning of behavior. Schools follow a very particular set of established norms about what is acceptable or not, what is important or not, and what actions are and are not valued related to many aspects of student performance and interaction, including behavior. It's also important to note that student bodies are diverse from varying cultural backgrounds where expectations around respect and engagement may be different from the expected conventions in school. The history of behaviorism and behavior modification is deeply rooted in effort to change individuals by training them to engage in more specific, acceptable behaviors through various techniques that reward compliance and conforming to those stated expectations, or performing in very particular or specific ways. These efforts have also been closely aligned to the ways that ableism and racism have been enacted in schools over time, especially for students with identified disabilities. These kinds of constructed understandings of behavior have led to viewing behaviors and students who engage in behaviors through negative lenses. An important need and a more responsive and holistic approach to understanding behavior is to recognize that all behavior is a form of communication. This is not to suggest that some behaviors are not concerning. Both internalizing and externalizing behaviors can be concerning for a student and those around them. However, if in challenging situations, educational professionals are able to recognize that a student's behavior is an effort to communicate something, then which might be the only way that the student knows how to tell us or show us at that time, then we can focus on what that something is as a means of determining what the student needs. In brief, understanding behavior as a form of communication is a necessary foundation for being willing to understand what a student is trying to communicate, what they need, and rather than focusing on how they are communicating it, which we often see expressed through behavior. A foundation of understanding behavior as a form of communication leads to a more empathetic and inclusive approach, responding to students' unmet needs in the environment, which we will discuss further in this module. Let's look at some examples of what it could mean to understand behavior as a form of communication. On the left side of this slide, you might notice several terms that are frequently used in schools in connection with students who present with challenging behaviors, including out of control, defiant, disrespectful, oppositional, and disruptive. Terms like these are all subjective in the ways that people would define them, but they all carry negative meaning and often lead to punitive approaches or consequences with students. An alternative way to think about our students and their behaviors is to ask ourselves what the student is trying to communicate. As we see in the examples on the right side, our students may be trying to communicate fear, frustration, anger, worry, or trauma, to name a few. What we see expressed through challenging behaviors could actually be a student trying to tell us that they aren't safe at home or school, that their basic needs are unmet, or that they feel insecure academically. Let's take a closer look at some of the things we know about behavior in schools. We know that behavior is one of the most frequently cited challenges by schools, and that need is continually increasing. We know that punitive thinking, punishment and consequence models, and exclusionary discipline like detention or suspension have not been effective in creating positive changes. Research also shows that students identified with disabilities are subject to disciplinary actions more frequently than students without disabilities. Within your responsibilities as a paraprofessional, you should know that students are entitled to behavior supports if they need them, and that you are a member of the educational team that is required to identify and implement behavior supports appropriately, just as we do for academic needs. So let's recap and make sure you're in the know about these legal foundations surrounding students' rights to behavior support in schools. 1, students who demonstrate the need must receive behavior support as part of their educational program. 2, an FBA or BIP, a functional behavior assessment and behavior intervention plan, must be conducted to make data-informed decisions for a student's behavior support plan. 3, these documents become part of the student's individualized education plan, which is a legally binding contract on behalf of the student. 4, all educational team members are responsible for implementing the behavior support plan and providing the necessary supports and accommodations. Now let's shift our thinking to multi-tiered systems of supports. This visual shows a 3-tiered pyramid that is titled academic instruction on one side and behavioral instruction on the other side. You might recognize this as the multi-tiered system of support, which is a means of providing proactive and research-based supports to all students, often organized through RTI, response to intervention, and PBIS, positive behavior interventions and supports. MTSS models allow for screening all learners in order to identify and address academic, social, emotional, and behavioral needs, and provide opportunity for students to experience success with targeted supports across 3 tiers of increasing need. Multi-tiered support models may avoid unnecessary and unsubstantiated referrals for special education services. In other words, if we can effectively use a combination of supports across these tiers, we will meet the needs of more students without requiring the use of special education services. Looking more closely at tiered supports for behavioral instruction and zooming in on that portion of our model, we can see these tiers provide increasing levels of supports, beginning with school-wide interventions for all learners to prevent behavior challenges. These supports and interventions are likely provided through some combination of school-wide initiatives and whole class strategies for all students in a given classroom. Some examples could include establishing clear, consistent classroom rules and expectations, providing active supervision and engagement, and learning opportunities for students, as well as providing social skills instruction for all students in a class. Notice that all students in the classroom are receiving social skills instruction at this initial base tier. In your role as a paraprofessional, you might be assisting with the implementation of any or all of these strategies, as well as providing small group or individualized support to students. Whatever your specific role, you are an important part of a collaborative team. As we move up in the tiers on this model, the intervention, supports, and services become more specialized and more individualized. So here in the middle tier, a smaller number of students are expected to need these supports, and the examples are designed for small groups or smaller number of students. It might be determined that a student requires these services based on a universal screening assessment tool, or after finding that even with the necessary proactive and preventative supports and classroom structures in place, some students still require a higher level of support. In Tier 3, the supports become more comprehensive, specialized, and individualized. These supports may also involve collaboration among more educational partners, external or outside providers or professionals, or even something like wraparound services provided between home and school and crisis response plans. It is important to note that students' needs may vary, and the tiers are intended to provide students the most effective combination of supports based on their needs. If after a range of supports and services are in place, a student requires a high level of support on an ongoing basis, a referral may be made for special education services. However, the intent of the multi-tiered model is comprehensive and flexible support, and students may move between the levels of support that they need at different times. It should not be used for only a brief time on a tier, or use of a single or few strategies and then a determination made that the student did not respond to the intervention or needs more. The majority of the intervention should be provided through comprehensive Tier 1 support. So that's that base level, with attention to ensuring a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment that attends to students' needs, the design of the learning environment, and the interactions and responses of teachers and support staff. Let's talk more about social emotional learning and what kinds of skills and strategies and competencies students need to be successful with the social emotional learning skills that they're learning as they grow in life, moving through life, as well as to navigate the school and academic environments that they are working in every day. CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, is currently the leading authority around social emotional learning in education. They are working on making evidence-based social and emotional learning an integral part of education from preschool through high school, so that all students have foundational skills needed to grow their social and emotional lives and develop relationships to be successful in an increasingly complex world. The CASEL framework is designed around 5 key competencies, shown in the center of the visual, highlighted in orange, green, and yellow. There is a video linked on this slide. This short 5-minute video will help you understand the key competencies of social emotional learning and the key settings needed for them. Pause this recording now to watch the video linked on this slide. Coming back to this slide, you will notice the additional circles that frame the 5 competencies in the CASEL wheel. Social emotional learning involves everyone. It utilizes the relational ecology of our school systems and school buildings and the various kinds of interconnected relationships, experiences, and settings that our students are continually trying to navigate. And so you see how in this video, all of the collaborative partners are expected to be working together. SEL is most successful when everyone is practicing all competencies. So who needs SEL? All students, everyone. Students and adults, in fact. Everyone needs SEL. Everyone needs opportunities to develop their social emotional learning competencies and skills. Just like we differentiate any kind of learning, we need to differentiate SEL and behavior support. There are many tangible applications that build into each of the 5 competencies that were presented by CASEL, either on the slide, in the interactive wheel, or in the video. Can you identify any of them here as they are laid out in the pyramid model for multi-tiered systems and supports? What's happening in your school? Do you see evidence of social emotional learning practices and the specific competencies in action? Think about that in relation to the tiers of building positive relationships as forming the foundation, designing safe and supportive classroom environments that welcome and value all students, teaching specific strategies and skills to allow all students to develop those social emotional competencies, and then planning for and providing intensive interventions for those students who are in need. Pause this video to make note of any ideas or questions you want to hold on to at this point. Coming back to the roles and responsibilities chart that you've seen through several of the modules so far, one more time, we notice that support staff are expected to engage in actions related to providing scaffolded support to the student, fostering peer support, increasing active participation in learning activities and lessons, providing direct instruction, and collaborating with the classroom teacher. Review the examples under each heading. Which of these are you already doing? Are they written into the student's plan? And is it clear how these kinds of supports across different areas of adult support, peer support, active engagement, instruction, and collaboration can support a student's behavior, perhaps reducing the behavior that we see in classrooms and supporting the student toward developing positive skills and behaviors that they need to grow and thrive in the academic environment. Do any of these spark new considerations for you in your role or with a particular student? If so, pause this recording again and make note of them so that you can bring them back to your team. Recalling the high leverage practice for ensuring a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment, Dr. Marcia Tate offers 6 F's of a great classroom manager. They are: be firm, be fair, be friendly, be fun, be flexible, and be forgiving. Ask yourself, how would you like to be treated? How would you want someone to respond in a moment of need or difficulty? These seem good advice, and we often see our students expressing some big emotions in some very challenging ways. Remember that consistency and collaboration are key for your working partnerships, all of the adults in your classroom, and most importantly, your students. Let's talk about some of the specific structures that could be used to support and promote student engagement. First and foremost, a positive school climate and a positive and safe classroom learning environments are essential and integral foundation for students to be able to have inclusive opportunities and promote student engagement that reduces behavior. This goes along or hand in hand with a culture of belonging, inclusion, and valuing diversity. And thinking about how we're shifting students' positions in the classroom, moving away from seeing disability as difference or othering to really creating meaningful opportunities to value our students and the diverse ways of being and knowing and the knowledge that they bring to classrooms. Co-teaching is another best practice and a structure that can promote student engagement. Perhaps you're part of a team that is co-teaching or using some of the co-teaching structures, and you're facilitating or supporting some of those structures, lessons, or groups. Also providing various ways for students to demonstrate their understanding. You likely learned more about this in the UDL module and have some ideas about how you can provide various ways for students to demonstrate their understanding, or what your student might need in order to have an opportunity to demonstrate their understanding in a way that might be missing right now. Giving students these opportunities can increase student participation, decrease behavior, and provide better outcomes for students in terms of academic access and performance. And finally, removing barriers to access and inclusion, thinking about what are those barriers in the educational environment and really working intentionally to remove those barriers in order to meaningfully support inclusion for all students that recognizes and responds to the diversity of student need in our classrooms. Some of the approaches that are being used or might be being used to support students and meet students' needs are systematic evaluation, strengths-based approaches, removing academic and environmental barriers, building community and connection, and peer interaction and natural supports. As we look to systematic evaluation, schools are required and expected to identify and assess students' behavioral needs, to create goals and objectives around students' behavioral needs, to assess those needs and make data-informed decisions about what kinds of approaches or interventions a student might need, and then to assess the efficacy of those interventions. One common strategy used is the FBA, the Functional Behavior Assessment, which looks at the student and the student's performance in a particular environment and uses, often you may be familiar with the ABC model or the antecedent, behavior, and consequence model, where we're looking at what was happening in the setting, what was the setting event, what might have triggered the student, or what was happening just before the behavior occurred. Then thinking about how to objectively describe the behavior itself. And the consequence, or C column of that model, is to think about what happened next, what happened immediately following the behavior. So consequence in that model does not mean consequences in punitive, though there may have been a consequence that came after the behavior. And if so, you would record that in the data as it was observed. Ecological assessments look less at the individual student and their particular interaction with the ABC model, for example, and look more holistically at the ecology of the environment, of the school environment or the classroom setting that the student is expected to engage in, thinking about what's happening in that setting at that time, what the student did, with maybe perhaps what degree of support or to what degree of success, what they needed to do, and then identifying the gaps or mismatches. So thinking about what did the student need to do in the environment that they either didn't do at that moment, or what kind of barriers might be in place that are preventing the student from being able to be successful. So thinking about the unmet needs in the environment allows us to identify the supports that students might need in that environment to close that gap, to remove that barrier, and to essentially address that mismatch so that's no longer an unmet need, but rather a response that meets the student's needs. Strengths-based approaches. Historically, we have focused on need, and particularly around behavior and challenging behaviors. The focus becomes very much on what students are demonstrating through behavior and need, and often, again, behavior is read as a negative thing or bad. If we are going to use strength-based approaches, we need to think about student strengths in all areas of performance, including social, emotional skills and behavior. And we need to identify really meaningful strengths here and authentic strengths that we can use to support students' needs in the environment. For most of us, if we took a skill that we were struggling with or something that was really hard for us and focused solely on that repeatedly, many of us would feel insecure, maybe shut down, probably not really be as interested in engaging in that as we might be otherwise. Whereas when we recognize student strengths and that all students have strengths and that those strengths are valuable, we can use those strengths as a platform to build on. We can use those strengths as an entry point to support students and to use those strengths to address their needs. Also thinking about removing those academic and environmental barriers through really intentional, targeted learning systems, structures, and models. And so thinking about using tiered supports as well as universal design for learning components, and then providing any academic accommodations or modifications that a student needs in order to be successful. And finally, building community and connection are key. They're the foundation of what we do. They're the foundation of those relationships that we need in order to address some of these behavioral needs that come up in our classroom. And the community that we create and support is the community that students experience and what students will enact. The ways that we talk about disability and interact with our students, respond to students' needs in the classroom, our students are always watching that and will repeat and enact that same culture and community that we establish around particularly disability difference and inclusion. And so thinking about how can we support peer interactions and provide natural supports in really authentic, meaningful ways that create opportunities for relationships and engagement between students that is mutually beneficial, that does value all students, and that allows students to build on their strengths in order to approach increasingly complex academic and learning tasks. So hopefully you have some ideas now about that tiered system of support, some social emotional competencies that you're thinking about for students, as well as some of the specific structures and practices that we can use to promote engagement, reduce behavior, and shift the culture around inclusion and behavior in our schools. Let's talk now about some specific opportunities for humanistic behavior supports. The ideas shown here come from the work of Causton, Tracy-Bronson, and MacLeod. This article is available in your resources should you want to look further into the research, resources, and examples provided by these authors. And I certainly encourage you to do so. But right now, think about a student who presents with challenging behavior. You're going to be planning for that student in just a few minutes. Here are some humanistic behavior support approaches that we might use, and you likely see overlap to the things we've talked about so far. Utilizing students as problem solvers, both to support engagement and building those social emotional learning competencies. Asking new questions about behavior, as we have since the beginning of this module. Designing responsive curriculums. Creating comfortable and safe learning environments. Providing choice, authentic choice, where students have the opportunity to make meaningful choices about how they communicate, interact, engage, and show us what they know. Cultivating opportunities for relationships and helping students navigate those relationships. Using strengths and preferences as a foundation for learning and a foundation for engagement that supports students toward success in academic environments, which we see reduces behavior. Discovering the communicative intent and meeting the students' needs. And you see highlighted just below that, give them what they need. If we know what a student is doing, then we know what they need. And so one of the things about the behavior support that could be a really valuable takeaway for you in this module is the idea of if a student is, quote, misbehaving right? We know what they're doing. Maybe they're showing us that they need an opportunity to talk, that they need an opportunity to move, that they're not ready to start a test yet, or that they're having difficulty following that through to completion. When we see those kinds of needs, we also know what our students are asking for. And so give them what they need, meet those needs. And too often around behavior, we make meeting those needs or providing those supports contingent upon a student doing something first, behaving in a particular way before they can take a break, before they can have an opportunity for movement or an opportunity to decompress, right? Different students need different things at different times. But giving them what they need, recognizing behavior as a form of communication, thinking about the communicative intent, and then providing what the student needs in order to get over that hurdle or to reduce the behavior, so that students can continue to be successful in our classrooms. And also, as we wrap up this slide, keeping it private, thinking about maintaining students' privacy, confidentiality, and maintaining students' dignity. Again, students see, understand, and recognize the way that we respond to challenging situations in schools and our classrooms, and they really are looking to us as models. Another one of my favorite quotes around behavior and thinking about relationships and supporting students and working through some of the really challenging things that we as educators and educational professionals are asked to do every day is to think about the quote, "They may forget what you said, but they will not forget how you made them feel." And so this is a part of being empathetic, acting from a place of love. And when we experience challenge and we're having difficult conversations, keeping those things private, both between adults on the team and when you are interacting with a student or privately addressing a student about a situation rather than calling them out in front of their peers. And finally, ensure that crisis response plans are created and in place for your students who might need them, so that you're not left without that in those very difficult, serious moments. Okay. Again, think about a student that you would like to learn more about and support because you'll be planning for them in a moment. One of the things that teachers often ask for are strategies and tips, right? And while it would be impossible to provide a comprehensive or exhaustive list, this resource provided by Pathway to Success, or this list compiled by Pathway to Success, has been provided for you as a handout, and it provides 60 de-escalation strategies and techniques that we can use as educators and educational professionals in our classrooms. And so you, in your role as a paraprofessional, would likely have opportunities to enact many of these de-escalation strategies. One of our most powerful opportunities in terms of crisis prevention and response is to recognize that we're the adults in the situation and to not engage in the conflict cycle. When our students are in crisis, when our students are in a situation where they're acting out and perhaps are expressing their emotions in very intense ways, they are in a crisis mode that it is our responsibility, right, to calm that situation, to try and break that conflict cycle, and to not further engage in that conflict cycle with them, recognizing that that won't go anywhere, right? And so here are some kind of things that you can do, and certainly you can look through this list and think about which of these strategies might work best for you or a particular student. Different strategies are better suited for different students. But look at the range of strategies that are provided here. And so even if we think about a quick scan, you can see things like a teacher or support staff's response, right? Calming, the ways in which we talk to students, recognizing their feelings and really trying to understand, making sure that we've understood correctly, so you're upset because, right? Or, sometimes we need to tell students it's okay to be upset, it's okay to be angry, but there's a particular way to do that. Asking our students' input, would it help if and sometimes we underestimate how well our students can tell us what they need or what they don't need, and how we need to respect that. Also thinking about how we engage in these spaces, our voice, our body position, the level at which we're talking to students, whether they have an opportunity to walk away or take a break or get themselves out of a situation in an appropriate way, right? In a situation where they're having difficulty, maybe they're not ready to discuss a challenging moment or incident yet. And so we need to give them more time in the de-escalation process before we ask them to reflect and discuss that. Thinking about how we can move them forward, how we can help, show empathy and kind of distract them from that one moment that is really weighing on them, to help them move forward to thinking about maybe a new way, a new opportunity, or a fresh start and a step forward. And so I hope some of these strategies will be useful to you. So we've reached our synthesizing activity in this module. In this segment of the module, you are going to be asked to plan for a student that you are working with right now, according to some of the questions on this slide, and pulling together much of what we've talked about in this module, or things that are really standing out to you in connection with a particular student. So right now, think about a child that you work with that is demonstrating challenging behavior. And think about specifically what behavior or behaviors you would like to understand better. And the first step in this will be, where will you start? Who will you need to collaborate with? What strategies will you use? And thinking about those systematic methods of evaluation, how will you collect data around that behavior, right? Or be a part of a team that's collecting behavior in a systematic way, data that is going to help you determine what that need is and make a data-driven decision about how to best support a student and evaluate a student. And that allows us to also revisit and revise. So if we need to increase the level of support, decrease the level of support, or change an approach altogether, we can do that through data-driven ways. So what behavior would you like to understand? How would you like to think about that? What the student's trying to communicate? Where will you start? And who do you need to collaborate with? Then think about, through the course of this module and your experience, what strategies could you use to address the student's needs? And perhaps what strategies could you use that aren't yet in place, or that extend what's in place? Or maybe they're different. Always asking ourselves, are the selected strategies supporting the student's needs while maintaining their dignity? So at this time, you'll want to pause the recording and plan or map out for your student some ideas and next steps that you would like to take back to your classroom and hopefully implement right away. Go ahead and pause the recording and plan for your student. On this next slide, I'll offer you a few more resources and encourage you to utilize at least one or two of them in your planning process. So I will go ahead and introduce those as well, and you can use those, click on those, and pause this recording as needed. So on this slide, you see a collection of leading online resources for educational professionals around multi-tiered systems of positive behavior supports, social emotional learning, and trauma-sensitive approaches. And so what you see listed here in activities, just briefly to let you know what you have here, is a research brief, which isn't lengthy, but really includes some important research base for educating the whole child in a holistic approach as a means of improving the school climate and supporting students toward more successful outcomes. And so if the research is something that you're interested in looking at, this might be a nice snapshot, as well as these 3 key websites for some of the centers for support around the key ideas and concepts and models that we've been talking about. And so the Center for Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, the website for CASEL, the Collaborative on Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and the website for Responsive Classroom. All of these offer really in-depth resources for educators, for educational professionals, for working with families, and help us with some specific strategies and resources on their websites, including working with families and considerations of equity in these models. And so again, pick 1 or 2 of these that you would like to look at to help you plan for the student that you are thinking about. I look forward to you coming back. Welcome back. This last slide offers some deep dive activities. These activities will help you understand actionable steps for humanistic positive behavior supports that can be implemented within a multi-tiered positive behavior support model around social emotional learning and with attention to trauma-sensitive approaches. It will also help you become aware of the potential harmful effects of behaviorist approaches and exclusionary discipline, including some of the strategies that we are still utilizing in schools today. Activity number 1, Education Revolution at Somersworth High School, shows a high school's transition from a punitive consequence model to a positive behavior support model that shifts the culture and community in the school to provide comprehensive behavior supports and really involve students in that process in a meaningful way. Activity number 2 provides firsthand perspectives of individuals who've experienced ABA, applied behavior analysis, as a method of behavior modification. And the third activity is a documentary called Restraint and Seclusion, Here Are Stories. The full documentary is 28 minutes and the abbreviated version is 17 minutes. So you can choose which of these might be better for you and your current time. Again, you can come back to any of these resources later. And these are deeper dive activities should you want to explore more deeply. And so the summary of key ideas as we wrap up this module is that all behavior is a form of communication. All students need to be taught and have opportunities to practice social emotional learning skills. So they aren't something that we can expect that students will just develop. Students need explicit opportunities to practice them and direct instruction to learn about them. The SEL and relationship building are the foundations to a safe and supportive learning environment and to providing a system of positive behavior supports. And finally, restorative and humanistic approaches to behavior result in better outcomes for students in schools than the punitive approaches that we had seen in schools for quite some time. You've come to the completion of this module. Congratulations. A reminder that you need to complete the check for understanding, and a reminder that all participants must require all checks for understanding prior to completion of the course. Thank you for your attention. And finally, the references with links for additional information that you might be looking for based on today's presentation.